Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today with a five-headed episode coming at you now. I'm trying to figure out. I was going to do something with Pentium or the five thing, and I lost track there. So there we go. But on my screen, in no particular order. Well, it is a particular order because I'm going to go from left and around, but in no significant order. Don't get me talking about that. No particular order versus no significant order. That's a whole other little thing that we go through. We've got Chris Coppola, we've got Eric Rush, we've got Dylan Holzmer, and we've got Robert Koshu joining today. And I'm not even going to let Chris give his tagline. We did a whole episode with Chris and his tagline, so Chris doesn't get to even deliver his tagline today. But I'll let other folks say hi. So Robert, starting with you, how you doing?
Good to be back.
Good to be back, Dylan. The newly married.
Good to be back, everybody.
The newly married Dylan Holzberg. Congratulations, Dylan.
Thank you. She's not sick of me yet. So far, so good.
Well, give her time, right?
There's still time. There's still time.
I've got the very festive in a Christmas sweater, Dr. Eric Rush. Dr. Rush, you are looking very, very, very festive today, let me just say.
Thank you, Don. I'm feeling very festive today, and I would also like to say hi to the good people.
Oh! Ladies and gentlemen, you have the address to serve him at, right, Chris? Now that I give you the chance to come in, how you doing, Chris?
Fine, you guys.
Sounds so
good
wrong.
People. How are you? How are you, good people, and Eric doing?
I think we have a podcast, guys. It's a podcast. I'm looking ahead on the calendar here, and so the release date for this episode will put us on Friday, December the 29th. We are pulling back the curtain a little bit. In all fairness, we are recording before that date, recording before Christmas. But part of the reason that we've chosen this topic today, and it sort of bubbled up and surfaced up as we were getting ready to come online here, is this idea of doing something that has a little bit of a Christmas theme. And so we're going to go back to a historical event that is tied to Christmas. By the way, we had a couple of choices here, and I think we will do a couple of different episodes over time. But the one that we've settled on is probably one of, I think, represented by one of the most famous paintings in American history. Would you guys agree with that in terms of you see that painting, you know what it is? And it's so famous that it's been mocked and sort of done as in various forms of, replacing it with something else. It in the Lord's Supper as a painting probably fit this thing of, where people have done various things with it at various points. But in this case, it's the famous image of the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army on a small little boat. Seems a little bit strong to even describe what it is. Basically, it's a glorified rowboat, a glorified canoe almost, that he's crossing the Trenton on, and it's him leading the charge of the Continental Army, making the raid across the Trenton on Christmas Day, where the Hessian forces are there. And so what we have is this event that's immortalized in American history. It was important to a degree militarily. It was a lot more important, though, in sort of terms of morale, I think, more than anything else, in terms of what it represented. We can talk a little bit about that. We talk about when it doesn't happen. But our fork for this event is just going to be really simple. Washington slips out of the boat, slips into the icy cold waters of the Delaware. And as a result of that, being in the heavy gear, the winter gear, the woolen gear that they're in, he's in the water for too long before he can swim to safety or be pulled out safely. And as a result, they arrive back on the shore that they launched from as they scramble back from the capsized boat. And unfortunately, there's no longer a General Washington that is alive. We were joking off podcast here. If you want to kill a president, we've got the cast of characters here on this thing to do it. And we can either save them or put them away. Eric Rush, that's your specialty, as we were talking about, because of the things that we've done there.
It is my specialty, and today we say, nobody's dead until they're warm and dead, because a lot of times you'll see some very significant survival ability for people who have really bad hypothermia, but that also requires modern knowledge and modern technology, and so that's not something we would be able to do in 1776. So once Washington is cold and dead, he's just dead.
So that's what we have. We find ourselves here on December the 25th of 1776. And we have a very different scenario than what we had in the historical what did. And so maybe as a starting point, Robert, you were mentioning this off podcast, so I'll throw this to you to do this before we jump to the what if. You're reading McCullough's 1776 right now, I think you said, or have recently. I've read it here within the last couple of years. So remind me just a little bit about the significance of the historical what did before we go down the what if.
Yeah, so we're at the point, the revolution is probably at its lowest point. We've abandoned, we won Boston. The British run off in early 1776. Everyone is, where are they going to reappear? Well, there's no other place to go but the most famous city in America then and now, New York. So Washington and the army marched down to New York. They set up fortifications. They get set up. The British show up at New York. Admiral and General Howe, the Howe brothers, show up with the largest British fleet assembled to that time, with one of the largest British armies assembled to that time. They make some initial overtures to, hey, you guys come back and all will be forgiven. And of course, this is after the famous July 4th moment. And basically, Washington and his group pretty much tell the British they can go pound sand. We're an independent country now. Matter of fact, there was a moment where they kept trying to send the letter to His Excellency George Washington 3 to 4 times, if I remember correctly. And the Continentals refused to accept the letter because there was no one in their camp titled His Excellency Washington. And then finally, the British, well, what do we call him? Well, he's the general, of course. So Washington is pretty much holding this whole thing together, even at that moment. Well, the British finally get tired of it. They invade. They do a bunch of circling movements. They take over the two forts, Fort Lee and Fort Washington, that were built on either side of the Hudson River. The Americans retreat. There's a Battle of Brooklyn. We lose a lot of soldiers. A lot are captured at that time. And about 2 weeks before Christmas, the revolution is dealt another major blow, because who most people thought was the man who was the quote unquote military brains behind the revolution at that point, Charles Lee, was captured by the British. So we're sitting here in Washington is trying to figure out, what can I do? And he figures out that there is a group of Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey. And the Hessians were German mercenaries who were put in place by the British to come help them out with their conquest of America, because, this is going to take a few more soldiers than we thought it was initially.
Right. So the revolution, the independence has been declared. That's the July
Right.
of 76 event. So this is removed from that. But the whole time you were describing that, Robert, I have songs from Hamilton in my head describing those events. I don't know if anybody else had that happening, but I've got, the Battle of Brooklyn, all the stuff that's there. I've got guns and ships, and I got all kinds of other stuff running through my head. But again, at this point, the outcome of the revolution is nowhere a fait accompli. We're not even the ballpark of anything there. In fact, you would argue there's no momentum that would even suggest there's the likelihood of a colonial win at this point. I mean, if you were to go, I guess I don't think you could probably place a bet on this in London, but if you had a chance to go place a bet, the odds you'd gotten decent odds for the colonial forces, because the British were still favored for all the reasons you would expect the British to be favored at this point.
And not only that, but the other part of it is December 31st is looming large, and the regular army enlistments are coming to due.
Right. And these are in some cases, if I remember correctly, these are troops that even while they are inside of their enlistments, they're still supposed to be there until the end of those enlistments, right? Until we reach the end of the year. Many of them have not even been paid, or if they have been paid, they've been paid in means that no one will actually take. In other words, they're being paid in script. They're being paid in something other than pounds. And so you either haven't been paid, or if you have been paid, it's in something you can't even use to buy things. So the morale is low. The military situation is low. It's just not a good place to be. And so now this gets us to our historical what if, which is now you don't even have Washington. As Eric said, he's cold and dead on the side of the Delaware. And so I'm going to throw it to you, Eric Rush, as a first starting point here. What happens, do you think, in the immediacy right after that? I mean, what is the situation there tactically and on the ground before we get into the larger strategic implications of this?
Yeah, I mean, things are not good. You have they've camped on the other side of the Delaware River in Pennsylvania, and things are in very poor shape. Morale is bad. Supplies are limited. Men are cold. They have, as you said, they haven't been paid, and this was very much an important decision by Washington tactically to breathe some life into this. He knew he had to do something, and as it turns out, this was a really, really brilliant move. But now he has no public relations victory, no morale victory to go on, and so presumably we would see over the course of December, you would see nothing. Most likely, you would probably see desertions increase significantly, and then on the 31st, everybody's enlistment's up, or at least many people's enlistment is up, and most of them would probably just fall away. And without Washington, there's really nobody to pull the army back together. We would assume that the Continental Congress would convene in some way and try to appoint a new general of the army, but who? Nobody really comes to mind that would even fill the shoes. I'm just thinking of in Hamilton again, the songs by George III, and one of the lines is, "Next to Washington, they all look small."
Right.
And he's not talking about generals. He's talking about John Adams and the rest of the people at that point. But but it still stands that there really isn't anybody to fill the shoes. And so as a national effort, I would presume that over the next few months, the revolution would fall apart. There would not be a concerted effort at that point. There would not be a continental army. There would be no means for the nascent country to push its will. So what that would mean is that every colony is likely to be on their own. And so what do they do at that point? And I think we talked a little bit before podcast what that could look like, but we would presume that some colonies would continue the fight. Some colonies would probably choose to make a peace with the crown. And the question then becomes, who's who and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think a fair thing to say there is that it's not like all of the colonies were equally committed in the real timeline at this point anyway. I mean, you had the territories, for various reasons, particularly Massachusetts being the real hotbed of the Revolution. But you had some colonies that were just sort of, they had gone along. There have been I'm now thinking about the movie 1776. All of this now gets filtered through my Hollywood and Broadway, sadly gets filtered through my Hollywood and Broadway way of thinking about things. But if you think about that, which is a fairly relatively accurate portrayal for a stage musical, I'll put it at that in terms of 1776. But it certainly does convey the fact that they weren't all in the same place, and there were a number of the colonies who were not exactly sold out to the idea of independence. Yes, some type of change, some type of alteration of the relationship between these colonies and the mother country. Yes. Taxation reduced, absolutely. But this idea of independence was an extreme thing when they got to that point, and not everybody got there at the same place or at the same time.
No, absolutely. I mean, and we know this even from our own history. New York in particular is a great example of a state that really didn't want to go this way. So much so that they just sort of stayed in the shadows and let things happen around them.
Right. Even while things were happening there, they were
Even
letting
while things were
sort of
happening
happen around.
there.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
they were letting
In
things
my
sort of
head,
happen
they're
around.
the first group that totally bails.
Right.
I would assume so. I think New York would be very quick, and especially this battle was supposed to happen in Trenton, New Jersey, which is not far away, and I think it would be very quick for New York to say, okay, we're done here, and to try to make as favorable terms as possible with the Crown.
So let's start with just that premise, using that as the first example, or maybe the representative sample that's here. So the delegates, this is the way that I presume that would go down. Would want to know if somebody else has a different thought. The first thing that would happen is the New York delegates to the Continental Congress would probably be recalled. They would no longer be there. So, even if there is still a Continental Congress in whatever shape that it's in, New York is not represented there at that point.
I agree.
And so that's the first thing that happens. And so let's just go down that path. So they're back, they're pulled back. I mean, does New York then take proactive action that says, they disavow the previous vote, from the delegates that were there? Do they have to do something that positively asserts their loyalty, or is it just a case of saying, no, we're no longer in rebellion, we're no longer seeking independence? I guess that's my question. How do you think that would go down? Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the first thought that comes to my mind is I don't necessarily think the New York representatives at the Continental Congress withdraw. I think the state government of New York tells them to, but these are people who were already supportive of independence. So I think what you have, and I'm thinking a little bit about what you saw in Virginia, where you had two shadow governments. You have a colonial government that is pro-independence and a colonial government that is pro-British. And I think what you're going to see here is there is still a colonial governor of New York. In fact, as I remember, they are in power right up until evacuation. After this, the Continentals never retake New York. So instead of anything as dramatic as what you're thinking about, it's just that government carries on, and you'll see other states where you're probably going to have rebellious governments, but they're going to become very much more precarious. They're not going to necessarily surrender, because surrender, what is the outcome for them if they do surrender? So you're just going to see a power shift to the official colonial governors. The British supported, I should say, colonial governors.
Yeah, that's the default, right? You have to move away from the default, or else that is the default.
Right, because they still recognize, the Crown still recognizes these people, a legitimate government in every single one of these colonies.
Okay. What else happens?
I think the other thing, once I initially was a little unsure about how, with what I just laid out, it is a gradual process. I think the region you see more of an effect in is the South.
Yes.
I think Washington was somewhat appointed to give the South some skin in this game. And if he is removed, I really don't, I think in those areas, you're not going to see an invasion. I mean, you're just going to see, again, the pro-independence forces melt away and hope nobody remembers them.
Yeah, I completely agree with Chris. I think you see initially some kind of, you see New York, and then I think you see maybe other mid-Atlantic states follow suit, and then the South follow suit pretty quickly. And so I don't think it's but a few months, and New England's on its own. And then they have to decide what they want to do.
How long does Virginia stay in? See, that I see North and South Carolina bailing
Fast.
It's kind of like I see New York bailing almost immediately. I see North and South Carolina bailing pretty quick after that, because when you look at the history of the Civil War in the North and South Carolina, it was much more of a civil war than a Revolutionary War.
In North Carolina, it was.
Yeah. So they bail. The Carolinas bail really quick as well. I think Virginia hangs on for a little bit just because of the influence of Jefferson.
Well, maybe I guess I could see that for a little while, Robert. I don't think even Jefferson's going to be enough to keep Virginia in for very long. And I think where the Carolinas go, Georgia goes.
Oh, Georgia, definitely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, I suppose I could see, I agree, the Carolinas, Georgia, almost immediately as soon as they see New York turn. I think, Virginia maybe hangs on for a little while with sheer force of will with Jefferson. We also have to assume, like, I think you've got a lot of dead men walking, after this happens. And so the question then becomes is how long does Jefferson stay out in the open after this?
You know what they probably do, just to kind of echo a little bit of what Robert presaged, they go west. If you look at, I'm thinking about Kings Mountain, for those of you that aren't familiar, was a battle in almost on the North Carolina, South Carolina border in kind of the western areas, where you had a bunch of local militias treat very roughly an invading British force. Washington was a classically trained British officer. He was trained in the European officer mode. He wanted to be a European officer. I think if you don't have his formal army, you get a Francis Marion. You get somebody fighting that kind of a war.
So you've got a lot of the the signers, those who are able to do so are, they go west. And so now you have a guerrilla movement in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. Is that what you're thinking, Chris?
Not even called that at this point. If you see colonial maps, all of the you'll notice
Virginia, as I recall, the
claimed a lot of this area.
Not to anger our Tennessee in here. There is no such thing as Tennessee.
There's no such thing as Tennessee. And I take your point.
Long strip like that because the colony of North Carolina went as far west as it was allowed to.
Yeah, and same with Georgia, or same with Virginia, and Ohio was claimed by Connecticut for a lot of this. But I guess I would say what we understand as the places, as the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee would seem to be sort of hotbeds for this sort of activity.
And not even that. I think what is today Western North Carolina.
Yeah.
What is today West Virginia and Western Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, all of those areas are
not well controlled by the local authorities, as we find out later after the Revolutionary War. Just think about like Shays' Rebellion, things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So do we think that maybe they would, when we start talking about the colonies, especially me from being the western part of Tennessee, there's, especially in this time period, there's a big distinction between the sort of eastern hill country of Tennessee once you're still in the Appalachians, like, in Knoxville and Johnson City, when you start to get more to, Nashville and Memphis further out west. I'm almost wondering if after a certain point, the Brits would kind of just enter into, I don't know that guerrilla war would really be all that protracted. Especially given the logistical issues getting across the Atlantic Ocean, I can imagine that at a certain point, when that point is probably up for debate, but at a certain point, you can kind of imagine that the main British government would kind of let everybody who's off in the hills across the Appalachians kind of do their own thing.
Ignore them.
I'm essentially envisioning almost like a if you take colonial Georgia and just call it Australia, that's essentially the kind of concept for everything, sort of west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi. It's just kind of, they
other
kind of
point-
you don't bother us, we don't bother you, as long as you pay your taxes and don't raise too much of a ruckus. We're not really going to worry about what you do out there, as long as you don't irritate the Indians.
Here's the other point. The Mississippi isn't what it is, what it will become. The farmland around Memphis and down into Mississippi, Alabama area isn't that rich. What the British want is lowland area where they grow their cash crops. They want Williamsburg. They want their tobacco. They want what they get from the coastal areas, which they can pretty easily get to and control. So I think they just ignore.
Yeah, the only concern that they're going to have is trying to keep the Indians pacified on the other side of the Appalachians, because British Native American policy is much different from what American Indian policy would become. As long as you don't start having these real issues like the American settlement sort of practice ran into with the Native American tribes, I think the British are probably just going to kind of not let them walk, but basically just sort of, as long as they kind of swear allegiance and go back, I think they're cool.
Well, frankly, I don't even think they really care what happens to the native tribes over there. Well, pox on on everybody's houses. We've got our area, and doesn't really matter what's going on out there in the hill country.
Except, and I'm going to throw this out, if you're setting up a guerrilla second set of revolutionaries, whatever we want to call it, west of the Appalachians, in what becomes known to in the Civil Wars, the Trans-Mississippi District. If you're setting that area up, there's a teeny weeny little problem down at the mouth of the Mississippi, controlled by who?
It was the French. It's New Orleans.
France.
Well,
Are they?
Orleans.
No.
No, it's Spain at this point,
Yeah,
right?
it's
France
not.
still
it is
controls
Spanish.
New Orleans.
Let's remember our Six Flags. It's Spain at this point.
Not down in New Orleans. New Orleans is still France. It's
still
France.
Okay.
Yeah, it's French.
But,
Florida is Spain. New Orleans is still, that area is still French. Spain starts in Texas. France still has all of Louisiana. So do the French, and there's still that French evidence up in Quebec, do the French start to make noise again?
Well, to me, that's where I was about to go, because, the ping pong ball here, and I don't want to go fully there yet because I want to ping pong around still in North America before we do this otherwise. Yeah. But, I always think of my simplistic, flow of history view of thinking is the connections between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They have different causations. There's all kinds of different things going on, but these two revolutionary movements, including some of the people that they exchange back and forth, a Jefferson and a Lafayette and these types of folks. Man, there's a lot of Hamilton running through my head right now, but that's okay. There are worse things in life than having that run through your head. But those sort of kindred revolutions, for the reason they're kindred revolutions in time, I think ultimately something happens in France, because France had to implode the way France did, because France was destined to implode with the revolutionary pressures that were there. But, part of what sparks that and creates things that lead into other things are French support for the Americans in revolt to the British crown. And then the flip side of that is, America pretty much doesn't want to be involved in foreign policy issues, but they are supportive of the French revolutionary things because of Jefferson's affinity and the other things that are there in the Lafayette connection. And so, one of the things, I don't want to go there immediately, but one of the ping pong balls here is, what does the French Revolution look like if there's not a preceding American Revolution? Well, I think it's an important thing to think about at some point.
Let me first kind of talk about what Robert brought up, which is the possibility of French involvement. I don't think there is any such thing, because there's no Saratoga. There's no moment where the French actually really think that this might actually go against the British. I think there's definitely influence. I think the French definitely use New Orleans to try and build kind of a highway up to Quebec, but I don't think they do it in any formal way. I don't think they intervene. I don't think Lafayette has anything to do with anything. I do agree that France is going to have a revolution. And I think when France does have that revolution, that is when you see involvement. I'm thinking about the Wolf Tone movement in Ireland. Basically, as soon as Britain and France go to war, France starts shipping weapons to anybody who says they're anti-British. In this case, it was Ireland. So I think if these people can hold out in the mountains long enough, which there's no reason to believe they wouldn't be able to, they would be able to keep a core of their group together. When the French Revolution happens, that's when things get more interesting. The other thing we haven't talked about is this: New England.
Yeah, I was about to go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's easy to lump together. Pennsylvania is, I think, a little bit more challenging because of where it sits and the role that it played in the Revolution. But, to the extent that we quickly said, yeah, the Carolinas and Georgia and probably Virginia are out, New England's been in and been in for a while. And so that fervor, that's the hotbed of the Revolution. There's all the things that happened there. That's why the first shots are fired there. So let's go down that path. What is the response in Boston versus the response in New York?
I think they try to double down. I think they reinforce their commitment to this revolution, whether that's ill-advised or not. And by the way, it's ill-advised. But they make a go of it. They try to form a new army or a new leader to a new army, and they try to take on the British.
So is it necessarily ill-advised in that the British get to keep the cash colonies?
True, the British get to keep the cash colonies. So do they? So how far will the British go to keep New England or to take New England back into the fold? If New England stays in the fight a little bit longer, would they be willing to make a deal with them, some sort of kind of self-governance, make them more like a dominion?
First question I have, and I have an answer for this.
Uh-huh.
I think our lawyer would be familiar with the saying, never ask a question you don't have an answer for. Who commands this rump New England Continental Force? And my answer would be a general who is nowhere near the Continental Army. He's actually up in Quebec when this happens. A Connecticut man who has no problem whatsoever making a pragmatic deal with the British. I wish you people could see the stares I'm getting because, of course, I'm talking about Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, that's
who you're talking about.
I was trying to think if it was Gates or Arnold, and
please tell me this is a universe.
I was like, is he talking about Gates? No, it's Arnold.
Supposedly planned for.
Well,
I would say in this case, Arnold's reasons for treason would not be there. I mean, essentially, at the end of the day, he did not feel appreciated. Well, he's going to be appreciated now. So he would really have very little reason to turn coat.
And the other thing, Gates is a Connecticut man. Arnold's a Connecticut man. Gates is a New Yorker.
Yeah.
So Gates is from a foreign colony right now.
What I struggle with, and struggle is the right word here, because I in my head I begin to see two possible outcomes here. I can sort of see the scenario where the British Crown says, we cannot let rebellion stand. We cannot let this. Somebody has to be made we have to make a point here. Somebody has to pay for what they've done in Philadelphia. Ironically, it's the people that are up in Boston that are probably going to have to do it now, but somebody has to pay for that. So I can see that scenario. It's just the nature of absolute monarchies. You can't have people running around saying you're not the absolute monarch. That's even a constitutional monarchy.
I was about to say we need to get Alexis on because they are not an absolute monarch in 1776.
That's true, but still a monarchy. Obviously, with one of the most powerful non-monarch, the parliament being powerful at this point for all the reasons that it is. I mean, we've gone through things like the Glorious Revolution and everything else to get to this point, but you can't let even Parliament wouldn't let New England having tried to get away with this without some form of recognition that something needs to be done back. The question is that the proverbial slap on the hand, and we're going to try to bring things back, get things back to where they were before. Maybe somebody eventually, it's almost like the missiles being pulled out of Turkey during the Cuban Missile thing. It's like, we went a little bit far with some of this taxation stuff, and we're going to let it up here in a couple of years. We just can't do it immediately. It's sort of an understood deal or arrangement. Or to Eric's point, revolution, man, they double down on it. Now they're going for it full bore. And now the only thing that the British Army has to worry about is containing New England and containing what's there and bringing the forces to bear on that. And I think that's just a matter of time before they gain control of Massachusetts proper. Whether they have to push into the interior or not is a whole separate issue.
I don't even know you have to go that far to really hamstring things. I think you take Boston. Boston, and I think whether people choose to continue fighting or not is in many ways immaterial. You take Boston and New Haven and Providence. So I mean, just thinking about where harbors are, how do you get material in? And you take those three cities, which the British are sure to do. Then all you have is overland routes, and that's hard. That's hard to do. So I think whether they officially choose to stand out or not after that is another story, but for all intents and purposes, at that point, that the revolution's over, or any existential threat to this for Britain is over.
And I think in the interest of someone's going to pay, Hancock and the Adams brothers are swinging from a noose.
Well, Boston's the most natural place to do it.
Yeah.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Boston is still the mercantile, not, New York is a financial hub of the 13 colonies. Boston is still far and away the trade.
There's
more
trade,
stuff coming in through Boston by a factor of 3 or 4 than into New York.
Absolutely.
So if they're going to chokehold something, that's the place that's going to do it.
Yep.
The rest can just kind of die out over time, and it might end up being like a North American Singapore.
But and you don't even necessarily have to. Eventually, you will land troops there because you have to do it. But you can blockade or siege Boston, whatever you want to call it, in terms of just isolating it. To what Eric was describing there, the ports, Boston and some of the other ports that are there, and they can't sustain. They don't have the resources. They're dependent upon the trade. If the ships aren't moving, the goods aren't flowing. They're a merchant class anyway. It's not like that. They can even feed themselves necessarily exceptionally well there. They've got to be bringing foodstuffs in at a minimum. So the British Navy is still the British Navy here in the middle of the 18th century. Yes, it is the middle of the 18th century. And I think so. I think we would all agree, and it's inevitable that that whatever is left over there in New England is not going to succeed, whatever it looks like or how bad it is or how long it takes. There's not a scenario where they're able to really hold out if there's any desire by the British Crown at all to prosecute the end of the rebellion, right?
Yeah, right. I do have the answer on who gets command, though. Potentially, if it's not Arnold, it's Artemus Ward. They give command back to Ward, who was the co-commander with Washington when Washington got over, because he was the original. He just didn't, to quote Washington, like to stray far from the smoke of his chimney.
It's interesting. So the question that I have then becomes, does this just go away with the other things that are there? Or is it only a matter of time before it resurfaces in a different form, maybe with a different, cause at being the spark for the second time around? And how long is the gap between the history that we know and when that second or that refreshed event happens?
So I want to say the next big thing that we can foresee, just based purely on the history of North America as we know it, and then compared to the British Empire, is I don't know if it would be violent per se, but I think you might see a fast forwarding of the Dominion system, what Canada and South Africa and Australia ended up doing, that revolves around the abolition of slavery. Because I think that's the next tinderbox where potentially all hell's going to break loose with people you're already probably violently suppressing, for 30, 40 years because of the last time they tried to get angry. You have to imagine that they would try to play that situation. I mean, in our timeline, the South seceded. So you have to wonder if the British were, in this timeline, realistically think they can even legislate away slavery. I think 1826 was the last year that it was active, I think, in Britain.
Sounds about right.
So you figure you've basically by 30, it's like the French general said after World War I, you've bought 30 years of peace, but what do the British do to try and stave that off for more? And I wonder if they might do a Southern colonies dominion and like a Northern colonies dominion to kind of keep, like, legislate a more delayed slavery abolition in the South where it's much more prevalent. Whereas the New Englanders, maybe you can keep them happier by saying you can go do your own thing and abolish slavery right now if you want to, as long as you keep paying your taxes.
So basically like Mason-Dixon line and maybe along the Ohio River. Those are Dominions, sort of.
Something like that. Or start breaking, New England, especially in because you've got Maine and New Hampshire territory up there, into sort of like an extended southern Canada. And then kind of go what we would consider quote unquote America as sort of the more southern part. I don't know.
I think that is the next. I agree, Dylan. I was sitting there kind of looking the dates up. 1834 for partial abolition for English for England. They had to become indentured servants for a period of time and then translated into freedmen. But 1793 is the Cotton Gin. So the Cotton King Cotton is starting to really kick up at that time. So here come, and by and large, North America had the largest amount of African slavery because we needed them to work the plantations, which is where all the cotton comes from. So if England stays the course and tries to pull full-on abolition, I can see the South switching sides real quick based on that.
Well, and the other question we've got to figure out is, so you've got obviously the sort of Atlantic coast colonies in this timeline that are still very much kind of a concern for the British. I don't know if chattel slavery becomes quite, obviously it's still going to be probably far and away the most prevalent sort of section of the world is in terms of chattel slavery is going to be the American colony still, but you don't have Mississippi, you don't have Alabama, you don't have, sort of that one part of Georgia. You're missing like half of the primary cotton growing areas of, the South that lead up to the Civil War. So I don't know that
it's
definitely going to be part of it. I don't know if that's the single, and that's the question is, does it stay with Spain? Do the French kind of get this weird, because the French have lost the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, Queen Anne's War, whatever actual name it has outside of the Americas.
7 years.
Thank you. You can imagine that they're, itching to get some of that land back. And now they've got at least Thomas Jefferson and some of the revolutionary leaders who have military experience. You can kind of imagine that they may start looking at teaming up with the Spanish to at least kind of limit expansion too far west past the Appalachians, other than these sort of, kind of Daniel Boone types that we talked about before.
So I don't know what it's going to be. I don't think the French Revolution happens in our timeline, in the right time for this. But I think if you look there's a reason you could not name what the European name for the French and Indian War was, because there was one of them every 10 years. And if the American Revolution is one of these wars, Spain gets involved, France gets involved. If not us, it's going to be something else. It's going to be another crown head. It's going to be, deposing King George because he's insane or something. And I do want to kind of challenge the assertion that the Americas are the home of chattel slavery. Haiti, which is French. And the whole reason that Napoleon sold Louisiana is because he didn't have Haiti anymore. He lost it to a slave revolt. I think the British are very practical. And when the next war comes along, they take an abolitionist standpoint to take down, because again, it is the cotton country is not what they currently control. It is a dying institution in the tobacco and the rice areas that they do control. But their mortal enemy has a cash cow that is 100% dependent on slavery. So they'll get real moral real quick in that kind of circumstance.
Is there a scenario where these, I don't know what to call them, because I agree. I think many of the names that we know hang, the famous thing, we'll either hang together or we'll hang separately. They hang as a result of this before it's all said and done. But these, I'll call them American firebrands, the New England types, the Sam Adams, the John Adams of the types that are there, the others as well. Is there a scenario in one of the, pick whatever you're going to call it, the next conflict between France and Britain, right? The next thing that comes along, whatever it is, whenever it is, again, depending on when the French Revolution is, boy, there's a lot of variables suddenly in that equation there that you have to account for. But is there a scenario where what we think of in the traditional timeline as the American revolutionaries look to France to be their champions in a way of getting independence, where they might even, sort of, well, the good news is we'll get rid of British taxes because we're going to become French.
Well, so I was thinking when we were talking about the idea of Americans going west, Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France. I mean, he was a diplomat. He spent most of the Revolutionary War, at least the early part, in France. We have a French city that sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River, the head of this vast swath of territory controlled by the French that is, albeit extended, walking distance from all of these other colonies that the rest of the revolutionaries got kicked out of. You have to wonder if at least some of them don't head towards New Orleans and the surrounding, now Acadian sort of territory as kind of a jumping off point for adventures in the Caribbean. Thomas Jefferson is a pirate. I don't know. Or heading up to sort of, like a Louisiana Republic, semi-autonomous French area that they can use to sort of annoy, the British colonies and also keep as a buffer from Spanish Texas.
I think what you would have is an American Republic supported by the French. And the only thing the French, I think, would ask for is a formal alliance. They're not going to
trading rights for the furs, because that's all they cared about in the Louisiana Territory anyway.
They are not going to populate this geographic area with their own people. They didn't even try it in Quebec, really, to any extent. So I think as long as they have a friendly government with a formal permanent alliance, because the guy that warned us against that died 20 years ago. And every time that there's another European war, they can turn the key and have an American front.
And I think that alone might help delay the inevitable question of, when does the French Revolution happen? Because, the financial problems that they have are really the main immediate cause of that after the Revolutionary War. So if you instead essentially, hand the keys over to the Americans who can administer your, Western colonial jewel and deal with your trade in the Caribbean for you, you got to, I'm shorthanding what is eventually inevitably going to be a bunch of trade deals and stuff, but you almost wonder if the revolution is going to get pushed out towards like the revolutions of 1848 and you get a sort of, not.
No,
you don't think so?
I really don't believe the French system could survive another general European war. I think they'll support, they'll do what we just talked about, but they'll still lose. And you're going to have a kind of a Russian 1917 situation where, hey, our side's winning, but our economy and political structure just collapsed on us.
So is there a Napoleon in this scenario?
I think he is Italian instead of French.
Okay,
Mhm.
so he's
He's
okay.
definitely Italian instead of French.
Yeah.
But,
So do we have a slightly earlier Italy of some sort? Not a full
No.
unification, but do we see that Sardinia Piedmont become more of a thing? Do we see two Sicilies? I don't know.
I don't see him.
He won't be a factor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
I
a
mean,
non-factor.
He's likely a very capable field grade officer for Italy or for Sardinia, Piedmont, whoever. But that's it.
Or for an independent Corsica state, because he's Corsican, and again
He's Corsican, but Corsica wasn't interesting enough for him, even as a field grade officer.
Yeah. So the reason I raised that as a question, obviously, eventually, what alters the American history landscape from a land sense, of course, is the Louisiana Purchase, which comes along because of what's happened in France. And as you mentioned, Chris, the French are already having difficulty maintaining their North American possessions. So why not sell them and get some much needed cash, be done with it, and sell it to this this new nascent nation that sort of has this. This is the burgeoning the manifest destiny's on the rise. So let's just let's let them buy the manifest destiny they want. We'll take a little money and run and go. But that's not going to happen now under this scenario. You might have a different way that, this French influence comes into be, but I don't think you're going to see it through the directs. Maybe you do. Maybe you see them selling it to these, American revolutionaries that are further to the west, right?
No, they grab it in the collapse.
Right.
Yeah.
They make enough of a deal. France supports them enough that they do some kind of an American state. I'm interested to think if people think how far north it goes. It might be that the Mason-Dixon line is the border between the U.S. and Canada. But as soon as the French government collapses, no, those Daniel Boone types are walking right into Louisiana.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
I guess the point. It's a good idea that General Washington stayed dry.
Yeah.
as it turns out.
Because again, now we've gone pretty far afield, as we often do as we go down the what if here. But we have nothing that looks like the colonial America that we had, the first 13 colonies. We don't have the United States, anything similar to what we originally have in the original timeline. And to the extent that there's an American nation that forms, it's not likely to be along the Atlantic seaboard. It's likely to be inland and south somehow in some way, to whatever degree that it is and whatever that means. And you change the forces there. Now you change the, Spain, Mexico, all the other stuff that goes on elsewhere. And
we haven't even talked about Simon Bolivar and all of that either.
Yeah, it's a very different place, because if you change the initial trajectory here in 1776 to where you don't end up with the United States as we know them, then obviously everything is off from that point on. Any other just broad thoughts? This is one of the things I think we could ping pong around forever, because it has all kinds of ways that it can bounce around. But Washington's pretty indispensable. I guess that's the point.
He sure is.
Yeah.
So in this universe, my only question is, what British colonial governor is a rap musical made out of? I guess is the question we have to solve. Since Hamilton's not in the picture.
I don't know. Sadly, the big loss way down the road here is we lose Lin-Manuel's masterwork before it's all said and done, because he doesn't have anything to write about. But yeah, good stuff. All right, any other thoughts, guys, before we close this one out? All right, you'll be hearing this if you're a listener shortly after Christmas. So Merry Christmas from the Fork and Time team. And as we roll in here into a new year, we certainly would hope that you had a good 2023 and that you're poised for a very good 2024. we're getting our mojo back. We're getting our momentum back. I think you'll see a live stream sometime in the first couple of months, hopefully, of 2024. We have some interesting ideas about what to do there. Stay tuned for what's going on the podcast. I'm going to say again, you just heard the recent episode. I didn't record it that long ago, but you heard it a week ago. Had a chance to talk to Chris Coppola, do sort of a, hey, meet Chris kind of thing, which I overdo and need to do it for some of the guys that we see here. Dylan's done that. We've never really done that with you, Eric, or with Robert, so we owe you one there too. But I will say that one of the things I've enjoyed in 2023 and I'm looking forward to 2024 is A Fork in Time and the room where it happened being what it is. So stick with us, guys. Visit the website, give us some feedback. Jump in on the Discord server. I just want to pick up on the thread that Chris and I talked about in the last episode. Keep topics coming. We're pretty good about finding these topics, but we will go to the same places we go because they're the same places we tend to go. That's just who we are and what we're there. And it's when we get pushed outside those windows that we go to different exciting places that cause us to think a little bit. So push us, guys. Keep us honest, but also push us. So for Chris, Dylan, Robert, and Eric, this is Don signing off. And just reminding you that if you happen upon A Fork in Time, our strong suggestion is that you take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/A Fork in Time or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/A Fork in Time. We hope you will join us next time.